and
Yeah.
myself.
Okay, so I think we are live. So I shall start. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, so good evening, everybody. This is Sharonna Banerjee from Team Voyages into the Past, Otit Probaho, and I welcome you to our fourth live session. We are extremely happy to have with us today Dr. Jeffery Long, who is Professor of Religion and Asian Studies at Elizabethtown College, Pennsylvania. Dr. Long specializes in the religious philosophies of India. He is the author of several books and articles and editor of the series Explorations in Indic Tradition. In 2018, he received the Hindu American Foundation's Dharma Seva Award for his work to promote an accurate and sensitive presentation of Indic traditions in the American educational system and popular media. The subject of his talk this evening is Sri Ramakrishna, the relevance of his teachings in the contemporary world. Sri Ramakrishna or Ramakrishna Paramahamsa is a celebrated name in almost every Bengali household. In his teachings, one finds a spirituality that is all inclusive and that remains relevant even today, almost 200 years from when he lived. It is a great honor to have Dr. Long with us today. We are so eager to hear more from you, sir. Welcome.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Namaskar, and thank you for your kind welcome. I'm
Namaskar.
grateful. Thank you. I'm grateful to have been invited by all of you to present today. And as Ms. Banerjee was just saying, Sri Ramakrishna is a well-known figure in every Bengali household, right? So I hope I can still shed some light on him today, even though I'm sure you're all very familiar with the stories of his life, with his teachings. It may be that I say nothing new at all today, possibly, but I don't want to assume too much. So I will give some background, basic facts about his life, his teaching, and of course, the central thesis today is why is this relevant? We are talking about a figure from the 19th century, right? We're now in the 21st century. Sri Ramakrishna Paramahamsa was lived from 1836 to 1886. So he was only with us on Earth for 50 years. And yet, during that time, he experienced many things and taught and shared many things, which I think continue to be really not only relevant, but even quite revolutionary for the world today. And so I want to give some of the background of his life and teaching and then explore those facets that are especially relevant today. And I also want to allow plenty of time for questions and discussion. So I know some of you might have questions and comments that we want to engage with. So I'll just begin by talking briefly about the life of Sri Ramakrishna, or Thakur, as many of us call him. He, of course, was born in a small village in what is now West Bengal, Kamarpakur. I had the privilege a few years ago of visiting Kamarpakur and actually seeing the place where he was born, where he lived, where some of the incidents of his childhood occurred. And he was born. Gadadhar Chattopadhyay was actually his given name, but he was called Ramakrishna from a fairly early age. Most of the men in his family had the name of Ram somewhere in their name. For example, his older brother Ram Kumar, his father also had the name Ram as part of his name. So the family was very devoted to Ram. They were Vaishnav and a very deeply devotional family. And so Sri Ramakrishna grew up in a very deeply devotional environment. His family were from the priesthood; they were Brahmins, and so his father performed rituals as part of his livelihood. And so he grew up in an environment which was completely inundated with devotional spirit, and he even within that devotional environment, he was unusual. There are many, many stories of his entering into a state that some might call a trance or an altered state of consciousness. He always used the term samadhi to refer to this. Samadhi, of course, is a term that we first find in the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, and where one becomes completely absorbed in the object of one's contemplation. And this happened to him spontaneously. It's a state of awareness that many people spend many, many years of devoted practice trying to achieve. And he was able to enter this state spontaneously and without difficulty. When he was a child, it's said that when he was around 6 years old, he was walking in a field and he saw some gathering storm clouds, and there were some white birds, some white swans flying in front of the dark cloud. And just the sheer beauty of this scene was enough to send him into this altered state. And he was eating some puffed rice as he was walking along, and he dropped it on the ground and just entered into this state for a period of time. Another very famous incident, when he was a little bit older, but still a child, he was in a play in his village, and it was a play about the gods and goddesses of the Hindu tradition. And he was playing the role of Shiva, the god Shiva. And he was dressed up to look like Shiva looks in the Hindu iconography. And while on the stage, he, in effect, became Shiva. He became completely absorbed in that state of awareness. And it was a very awkward moment because it was a play and he was supposed to recite some lines, and there were other children there and they were playing different parts. And just in the middle of it, he goes into this altered state, and that was the end of the play. From a very early time, the people in his environment were concerned about him. They feared that these altered states of awareness might be evidence of some neurological disorder, some condition. But he didn't show any of the conventional signs that we associate with epilepsy or any such state. He didn't fall to the ground or foam at the mouth or injure himself. Typically, he just went into this state and he came out and felt very blissful and happy afterwards. And this continued on for throughout his lifetime. When he was a teenager, his older brother Ram Kumar had gotten a job as a priest at the temple of the goddess Kali, Ma Kali, in Dakshineshwar. And so he asked his younger brother, Ram Kumar asked Ramakrishna to come and join him. And Ram Kumar was very concerned for Ramakrishna. Ramakrishna was not very interested in school as a student. He didn't find school particularly interesting. He did love art, and what was actually a gifted artist himself, but not so inclined to reading and study. This has given rise to a popular misconception, though, about Ramakrishna. You'll sometimes see it said that he was illiterate or barely literate. That's actually not quite true. He was literate. He was able to sign his name. In fact, if you go to the museum at Belormat, you can find some documents that bear his signature. So we have his signature. He was able to sign his name. He was able to read a little bit, but more often he would ask people to read to him, and he would listen to accounts being given. He would listen to the Hindu scriptures and works of philosophy, and he possessed quite a few books. But rather than read them himself, he would ask people to read them to him, and he had an excellent memory. And of course, this is something many people in India have been gifted with through the centuries. There are people who study and commit to memory not only a brief text like the Bhagavad Gita, but the whole Mahabharata or large portions of the Rig Veda. People memorize. So he had a very good memory, and he therefore had actually mastered quite a few texts, more than people often realize. The fact that he did not read them but had them read to him is what I think causes some confusion about this matter. But back to his teen years, his brother was concerned about him because he didn't seem very interested in studies. His brother, on the other hand, Ram Kumar, was very studious. He was a Sanskrit scholar, and he brought Ramakrishna with him to Dakshineshwar, hoping that he could train him. He could teach him to be a priest like himself, to carry on the family tradition. And the temple, the Kali temple at Dakshineshwar, is a very interesting place. it was constructed by a very wealthy woman in Calcutta at the time named Rani Rashmani. And Rani Rashmani came from what today we would call a scheduled caste background. And this actually reveals something very interesting about Sri Ramakrishna, that growing up a Brahmin, he was initially hesitant to work in a temple that was run by someone from what would be called at that time a lower caste. And yet he very quickly overcame this and found that later in life that that according to his teaching, the same God dwelled in everyone, and he grew to have a very warm relationship with Rani Rashmani and with her son and other people involved with the running of the temple. So he quickly overcame these sort of biases that he'd grown up with. And when he was brought to the temple and began working there with his brother, training under his brother, an event happened which really caused a great shock to the young man. His brother suddenly died, passed away, and we have to imagine what it must have been like for this young man from a village. He's in a new place, new people, new environment. And the one person that he knows and that he feels very comfortable with, his brother, is suddenly gone. So he felt very much adrift, you could say, in a sort of social sense. And I think, as many of us do who experience a tragedy or a loss in life, he turned to God. He turned to the divine as a source of comfort. And he developed a very strong conviction that if he was to be a priest of this goddess Kali, he needed to know that she was real. He needed to know that he was doing something meaningful, that he was not just repeating ancient ceremonies in front of a statue, but that there was a living goddess present in some sense in this temple. And so he began to pray very, very longingly. I mean, it's hard to put into words the depth of the emotion that he had when he was praying for a vision of this goddess. Please reveal yourself to me. Please show me that you are real. If you are real, can't I see you, right? And each day that would pass when he had not had a vision of the goddess, he would count as a wasted day, and he would cry, he would weep, and people around him began to worry that he was mentally unbalanced because he had so uh, become overcome with emotion at this longing to see the goddess. And the longing became so intense that he actually reached the point where he considered taking his own life because he was not seeing this vision that he wanted so badly to see. And the climactic moment of this process came when he was in the temple and in front of the murti, the pratima, the image of the goddess, and he said, if you don't show yourself to me, I'm going to take my own life. And there was a sword hanging on the wall in the temple, and he went to go and grab it, and his intent was he was going to cut his own throat. He was going to end his life. And at the moment he reached out to do that, everything around him changed. The room melted away, and by his own account, he said that he saw nothing but waves and waves of light. It was like an ocean of light that was flowing over him and almost threatening to drown him and overwhelm him. And this light was made of pure love and pure consciousness. And he realized that this was the form of the goddess, that he was seeing the goddess not as she appears in her iconography, but as pure light, as pure consciousness, pure love, pure awareness. He was completely overwhelmed by this. And for days and days afterward, he was in almost a state of intoxication, you could say, that things did not appear as they normally do to him. He saw everything filled with this light of the goddess. And some of his behavior became quite eccentric at the time. But he was a priest, and so, of course, one of the things the priests do is accept the food offerings that the devotees bring to the temple, that's then later distributed as the prasad. He took the food offerings one day and gave them to a cat. that had wandered into the temple, and people were very offended, and they went to the temple officials, and they said, what is this man doing? And when he was asked about it, he said, well, Ma is everywhere, and she's also in the cat. Why can't I feed Ma in the form of the cat? To him, it was a very simple thing. And fortunately, the manager of the temple, the man named Maturnath Biswas, who was a close relative of Rani Rishmani, he had some insight into Sri Ramakrishna, and he said to the people who were objecting, he said, let him do what he wants. Let him be. God is with him, and so we should just let him do what he wants and not be too concerned. And so Sri Ramakrishna was given the space, you could say, we would say today, in which he was free to pursue his spiritual desires, his spiritual longings. After this experience with the goddess, he determined to experience the divine in other ways. And so we see from the accounts of his life that he took up a series of spiritual practices. He took up a devotion to Ram, and there were many holy men who would travel and stop at the Dakshineshwar temple because it was on the route to Puri, where the great temple of Jagannath, of course, is. And so a lot of pilgrims would, from different parts of India, would stop at Dakshineshwar on the way. So he had many, many conversations with holy men, with wise men, with philosophers, and wise women. There was a yogini called the Bhairavi. Bhairavi Brahmani is how she was known. We think her given name might have been Yogeshwari, but we're not 100% sure about that. And she became one of his teachers also. And so there was a succession of teachers who came. One wandering hermit was a great devotee of Ram, and he had a silver murti, a silver image of Ram as a boy that he called Ramlal, the boy Ram. And Sri Ramakrishna became completely enamored with this image of Ramlal, and he would play with the image, and in his mind he was seeing the image come to life like it was a little boy, and they would play together and they would run together and so on. And he became so attached to Ramlal that when it was time for the sage to leave the temple, he gave Ramlal to Ramakrishna. He said, no, he has come alive for you in a way that he never did for me, so you take him. And as a devotee of Ram, Sri Ramakrishna also took the attitude of Hanuman. And Hanuman, of course, the great servant and helper of Ram, he was in the form of an ape, and said that when Ramakrishna used this form of devotion, when he took the role of Hanuman, he would jump around like an ape, and he would eat bananas, and he would climb trees, and just completely become Hanuman. And so he pursued his spirituality with complete 100%, we might even say 1000% devotion. Right? He was not inclined to do anything halfway. When he decided he wanted to see God, he said you had to devote yourself completely to seeing God, just as he had done for his vision of Ma Kali. So he had these various styles of devotion to Ram that he followed, and then he became a devotee of Lord Krishna. And he took the attitude of one of the gopis, one of the women devotees of the young Krishna that we read about in the Bhagavata Purana. And he dressed like a woman, and people even commented, oh, who is that beautiful woman in the temple? We haven't seen her before. And others would say, oh, you don't recognize him? That's Thakur, that's Sri Ramakrishna. But he became so absorbed in that role that no one could tell, except the people that knew him well, that he was really a man. He had completely absorbed himself into that devotion. Under the Bhairavi Brahmani, whom I mentioned before, he followed the various tantric rituals, and through those practices, through those meditations, he achieved realization. Every path that he followed until he had one of these great samadhi experiences where he experienced this total absorption into the divine. And he concluded, as a result of his various practices, that all of these ways are effective, that if you devote yourself to God as Ma Kali, you will experience Ma Kali. If you devote yourself to God as Ram, you will experience Ram. If you devote yourself to God as Lord Krishna, Sri Krishna, you will experience Sri Krishna. If you devote yourself to God as Shiva, you will experience Shiva. And then another of his teachers who came along, a monk named Totapuri from the Advaita Vedanta tradition, he taught Sri Ramakrishna the non-personal approach to the divine, that rather than think of God, as a person, as one of these deities like Ma Kali or Lord Shiva or Lord Krishna, to pursue the formless Nirguna Brahman that, according to Advaita Vedanta, underlies all of existence and all of the gods and goddesses. And he taught Sri Ramakrishna to have that experience. And Sri Ramakrishna did. And in fact, he entered into a state of samadhi that lasted for several months. And he had to be fed and cared for by his nephew because he wasn't able to get up and eat and move about like a person normally would. It was almost like a catatonic state. But when he came out of it, he said he had been absorbed in Nirguna Brahman that whole time. And so at this point in his life, Sri Ramakrishna had pursued just about every path that was available in the Hindu tradition. He had pursued Shakta, Vaishnav, Shaiva paths, the Advaita Vedanta non-dual path, and in every one of these he had experienced the divine. And so then he turned his attention to traditions from outside of India. Christianity was present in India in his time because, of course, this was the period of the British Raj, British rule, and there were Christian missionaries and there were Bengalis who were interested in Christianity. And he would go to the house of a devotee and hear readings from the Christian Gospels being read. And he once saw a picture of Jesus as a child with his mother, and it reminded him so much of Ma Kali and the love of the Divine Mother in the Hindu tradition that he became completely absorbed in that image and had a samadhi experience. His Christian sadhana, as we call it, culminated with a vision of Jesus. He had a vision of a young man who was not Indian, come walking toward him while he was sitting on the banks of the Ganga, and he heard a voice in his head basically say, "This is Jesus. This is the one who came and gave his life for humanity." And he embraced Jesus, and the two of them merged and became one. He felt Jesus becoming absorbed into his consciousness. And then, of course, the other tradition from outside India that's been very prominent in India for many centuries, of course, is Islam. And he also went to a Sufi teacher, a Sufi master, and he followed the Islamic path. And it said for 3 days, he put aside his murtis, he put aside all of his traditional items that were associated with Hindu devotion, and he lived like a Muslim. He prayed to God in the formalist form taught in Islam. And after 3 days, he had a samadhi experience there too, and he had a vision of the Prophet Muhammad, who appeared to him as a being of light. And much as in the vision of Jesus, the two embraced, and the Prophet Muhammad became absorbed into Sri Ramakrishna. So how do we think about this? Right? We're students, we're scholars, we're people of the 21st century. It's tempting to look at all this as very mythological, right? It sounds like something from a great story that someone would write. It sounds like something from the Ramayana or the Mahabharata. You have this great visionary, and he has a series of sort of mystical journeys where he attains union with various divine beings, divine figures. It's very easy to look at this in a skeptical way, and in fact, many people during his lifetime did so. As I've already mentioned, even as a child, there were those in his family and in his village who feared for his sanity. They thought he was suffering from some nervous disorder that led him to go into these samadhi states. And when he was in samadhi, it was hard to bring him out. He would be completely absorbed in the divine. And of course, the very fact that he was so preoccupied with religion, with spirituality, this is something that you sometimes find in people with mental illness. They claim to have visions and so on. And people in his time were, quite a few of them were skeptical. At the same time, Sri Ramakrishna, except for those times when he was very deep in samadhi for long periods, like the Advaita Samadhi, with those unusual exceptions, he was a perfectly functional human being. He was able to carry out his priestly duties. He regularly met with visitors in the temple. And in fact, he developed a reputation for being extremely wise, and not only wise in spiritual matters, but also in practical matters. There's a great story. One of his disciples went to buy a water pot, and he went and bought a water pot, and it turned out the water pot was leaking. And Sri Ramakrishna said to him, well, didn't you check it before you bought it? And the disciple said, well, Master, you taught us that God is in everyone, so I trusted the man who sold me the water pot. And then he said something in Bangla, which you all know better than I do. I can't replicate it, but it was to the effect that because you're a bhakta, a devotee, that doesn't mean you have to be a boka, which means a foolish person, right? Yes, God's in everyone, but you need to check the pot before you spend money on it. So he was very practical and knowledgeable about worldly affairs as well as spiritual things. So if you want to say that this is a person who was mentally ill, who was unmoored from reality, and so on, and then focus exclusively on some of his more unusual experiences, it's possible to do so. But then that requires you to ignore the rest of his life, in which he functioned perfectly well, and in fact, I'd say was a very high-functioning individual, because so many people came to him for advice. You don't go to a mad person for advice. You don't go to a mad person to get wisdom about what to do with your life. But this is what happened. People came to him, people from all walks of life. Early in his career, meaning sort of after the period of the sadhanas, which we've discussed, and then now getting into his later life, and we're getting into his 30s and 40s now. Initially, a lot of people came to him who were like himself. They were people from villages, they were simple devotees, but they had heard that this was a very wise man, and they would go to him for advice. Men and women, sannyasis and householders, again, people from all the different levels of society, wealthy people, poor people, everyone would come to Sri Ramakrishna. And then finally, getting into his 40s, he started to have a lot of followers who were young people, students, people like many of yourselves. And this was really, I think, one of the more pivotal moments in Sri Ramakrishna's life, because it was these student disciples who would then take his message and spread it to the world. If it were not for these student disciples, Sri Ramakrishna would have been a very remarkable person, but probably only known locally, if then, right? His memory might have vanished, except for maybe from that immediate area where he lived and worked. So the student disciples, many of them became monks, sannyasis, after Sri Ramakrishna passed away. Of course, prominent among them was Narendra Datta, who became Swami Vivekananda. And of course, it's because of Swami Vivekananda that people like myself, not from Bengal, not even from India, have been drawn to and taken an interest in, very deep interest in the teaching of Sri Ramakrishna, because Swami Vivekananda brought this teaching to the Western world. People are familiar probably with his famous speeches at the Chicago Parliament of World Religions in 1893. He established the first Vedanta Society in New York in 1894. And of course, then went back to India and established the Ramakrishna Order and Ramakrishna Mission, and then took another trip to the West, another trip to America, and then finally returned to India and passed away in 1902. But going back to Sri Ramakrishna, he had these young disciples, and many of them were skeptical about religion. There was a very it was a very vibrant time in Calcutta in the 1800s, because with the coming of the British and Western culture, Western civilization, there was a real sort of clash of worldviews. And so you had young people who had grown up in Hindu households with traditional Hindu teachings, but then you had many of these teachings being challenged by the Christian missionaries and by people who were exposed to more skeptical Western philosophies. And really, I think one of the great movements to emerge from this clash of worldviews was the Brahmo Samaj, started by Ram Mohan Roy back in the early part of the 19th century, before Sri Ramakrishna's time, and continued by Devendranat Tagore, who, of course, father of Rabindranath. Devendranat Tagore was a great religious thinker and philosopher in his own right. He lived for a very long time and ran the Brahmo Samaj and really shaped it very strongly with his thought and his experiences. And then out of the Brahmo Samaj, of course, came Keshav Chandra Sen, who wanted to unify Hinduism and Christianity. He saw great insight in both. And one of Keshav Chandra Sen's disciples early on was Narendranath Datta, Swami Vivekananda. He was a follower of Keshav Chandra Sen before ever meeting Ramakrishna. In fact, it was through Keshav Chandra Sen that he had his first meeting with Ramakrishna. Sri Ramakrishna was a good friend of Keshav Chandra Sen, and he came to his house several times. And on one of those occasions, Narendranath sang a song, and Sri Ramakrishna was very impressed by him and very taken with his singing and with the deep devotion that clearly was behind that singing. For Narendranath's part, he really didn't take a great interest in Ramakrishna until one of his teachers at school, actually, a Scotsman named William Hastie, told Narendranath that, if you want to know about God, you should go and speak to this man named Sri Ramakrishna. He lives at the temple in Dakshineshwar. You should go and meet him. And this meeting, of course, is very famous. Narendranath was a skeptic. He wasn't sure if God was really real or if this was all made up, what he should think. And so he asked Sri Ramakrishna, have you seen God? And he had asked many wise people already at this point the same question. And of course, everyone said, no, you can't really see God with your eyes. It's not like that, And that always left him dissatisfied. Sri Ramakrishna was the first one, the only one to say, yes, I have seen God. In fact, I have seen him with greater intensity than I am seeing you right now. In other words, he had seen God in a way that was more profound even than seeing someone with your eyes. And Narendranath initially thought, as many did, that Sri Ramakrishna was a madman, but he felt something very compelling about him, and he returned again and again, and finally became one of his closest, maybe his closest disciple, and continued and carried on his work after Ramakrishna passed away. So what is the relevance of all of this today? That's the title of our discussion, right? The relevance of Sri Ramakrishna's teaching. And I think this relevance is very profound. I think it's something we could write entire books about, but I'm going to summarize it in 2 points. I think there are 2 main facets of Sri Ramakrishna's teaching that are profoundly relevant to our present day situation globally. And I think both America, my country, and India, your country in particular, can learn a great deal from Sri Ramakrishna. 2 things. First is the term we use as scholars for this is his pluralism, right? His pluralism. That is the idea that he saw truth in many, many different traditions, and he saw the practice of many different traditions as legitimate ways to God, right? Legitimate ways to an experience of the divine. And this was not for him a dogma. It was based on experience. It was because he had tried all of these paths in this very intense way that I've described and had the experience that he was looking for in each of them. And each experience was subtly different. He experienced love from the goddess. He experienced that impersonal pure consciousness through Advaita Vedanta. He had these wonderful communions with the Prophet Muhammad and with Jesus through Islam and Christianity. And so in a world that is filled with religious conflict, a world in which people literally lose their lives because of their belief, a world where there's persecution and hatred, as Swami Vivekananda said in his famous Chicago speech, bigotry, sectarianism, fanaticism, the response to all of that hatred from Sri Ramakrishna is, no, all of these are ways to the divine. They should all be respected. They should all be practiced. They should all be celebrated. We should all learn from one another. That no one path is the exclusive way to the divine, and all should be respected. The other aspect, that was one, is pluralism. The other aspect that is, I think, extremely important, equally important, is the experiential dimension of Sri Ramakrishna's approach. He didn't simply take things on faith. We don't often hear him described as a skeptic because he was such a bhakta, he was such a devotee. But then we forget that the motive for his great longing to see Ma Kali was in part driven by a certain type of skepticism, right? He was saying, unless I see the goddess for myself, I can't be her priest. I can't devote myself to something that I cannot perceive. And so this is a very experimental approach to truth. It's not simply believing things on faith. And so I think in this sense, Sri Ramakrishna is relevant not only to the conflicts among the world's religions, but also to the very kind of ongoing struggle between religion and science, or faith and science, or faith and reason. They're different ways of articulating that. But this sense that there is a very reliable sort of methodological approach to the study of reality that yields all kinds of insight, all kinds of knowledge. We have that approach. We have science. On the other side, you have religion. It's based on faith and people believing in old stories, and it's not reliable, and people fight over it. So let's just be scientific and set religion aside. And I think Sri Ramakrishna addresses that as well, that science itself, while it is very powerful way of learning and knowing about the world, is focused entirely on what we can perceive with our senses. And I think Sri Ramakrishna challenges us to take very seriously the idea that there is knowledge that is not of a sensory nature. And in fact, in this way, he anticipates one of the great philosophers of the 20th century in the Western world, Alfred North Whitehead, who also affirmed this doctrine that sensation alone is not our only source of knowledge into truth, and that this idea of a knowledge that can go beyond the senses is something that can itself be tested experientially, and that he tested this, and that if you look at his experiences and the experiences of many other great mystics from many different world religions, they're describing many of the same features of ultimate reality, which suggests that, doesn't prove, but it suggests that, like the sensory world, this realm of the spirit also has certain definite features that we can explore just as we explore the material world with science. And of course, this is something that is only just beginning. So I see people are beginning to ask questions in the comment area. So this might be a good way, a good point at which to make a transition into the question and answer session. So shall we do that?
Yes, sir. Okay. So first of all, that was an amazing talk by Professor Jeffrey Long. Ramakrishna is someone very close to our heart. I mean, every Bengali house, you walk into every Bengali house and there's a picture of Ramakrishna, Sharoda Devi and Vivekananda. And I can see one right behind you.
I have one right behind me.
Yeah.
And I have more over there, but you can't see them. So yeah.
Okay. So the thing is that Ramakrishna is like an emotion to us. And I think even beyond Bengal, like just the thing is with you. And you explain things so beautifully, like starting from the small stories attached to him to the complex, the complex notions like pluralism. It was beautifully said, sir. Thank you so much.
Thank
now
you.
I just okay. So now let's move on to the questions. I can see a lot of questions. Okay. So the first one, Onindo Shen, he asks that with aggressive Hinduism gaining an upper hand in India today, do you think that Ramakrishna's message to humanity at large can act like a balm in this tumultuous space?
Yes, so that's a wonderful question. And the short answer is yes, but I think you want me to say more than just yes. Yeah, that you mentioned Mr. Sen mentioned in the question aggressive Hinduism, and it's interesting. My first exposures to Hinduism were through the teachings of people like Sri Ramakrishna, Swami Vivekananda. I read the Gita. Swami Prabhavananda, who was a very prominent member of the Ramakrishna Order in America. I read a lot of his books, and at one time, if you had said to me something about aggressive Hinduism, I would say that's a contradiction in terms, right? That Hinduism is about ahimsa, it's about nonviolence, it's about love, it's about seeing the divine everywhere. In the Gita, Lord Krishna says, you should see me in all beings, and anyone who sees me in all is not lost to me, nor am I lost to that one. And yet we find that even this very beautiful, very gentle, pluralistic philosophy can be taken as a kind of mark of tribalism. And if I can define tribalism very briefly, basically it's the tendency we seem to have as human beings to form ourselves into exclusive groups. And forming into a group is fine, right? If you form into a group of people who are like-minded and share certain interests, that's great. Then we form great friendships and bonds of love and so forth. But it almost always seems to be accompanied by the need to belittle other such groups. So our group is the best, right? And one place where you see this is in sports. And of course, everyone always loves their own sports team, and the other team is terrible, and ours is the best. And if our team does poorly, it's not because they did poorly; it's because, well, the other team cheated, or I mean, we really want to think that our group is the best. And so this has become true of the world's religions as well. And unfortunately, Hinduism is no exception. It should be an exception. If you look at the teachings, the ideals, you would think, oh, Hindus won't fall for this. But Hindus have fallen for this. And I think there are complicated historical reasons for that. I think a lot of it has to do with the colonization of India. The British followed a divide and rule policy and sort of reinforced the sense of these mutually exclusive identities. And after the British left, that legacy remained. And so now you have a very aggressive version, really kind of a perversion, not only of Hinduism, but you see this in every religion. There's this highly militant side of Islam that has become very forceful in recent years. In America, we have the fundamentalist Christianity, and I've experienced that through much of my life. And it's also very aggressive. And the teaching of Ramakrishna, I think, shows us that all of this tribalism is the opposite of what religions were designed for. I see a religion as a set of practices and beliefs. The great religion scholar Houston Smith used the term spiritual technology, ways of transforming our consciousness through study, through devotion, through meditation, through service. That's what it's really about. It's not about, oh, our group's better, let's go beat up the other group. If you want to do that, then you have sports, right? Go do that with sports. Don't do that with religion, I think. Making this case is very difficult, of course, because if you make this argument, then people will say, oh, you're anti-Hindu, right? You're anti-Islam, or you're anti-Christianity. Whereas if you're coming from the perspective of Ramakrishna, you're saying, no, I'm actually very much pro all of those things. But it's the people who claim to be representing those traditions that are actually getting them wrong, that are actually using them as a sort of banner of tribalism rather than to really transform themselves and the world in a positive way. So I think we just have to keep just repeating this again and again. My great hope is that people will eventually realize for themselves that this very aggressive way of living and thinking is no way to live. It fills the mind with anxiety. I notice there are a lot of things on social media that almost seem to be calculated to fill us with rage and to just be in a constant state of anger. Oh, I can't believe they did that. I can't believe they did that. And, just tune it out, I would say. Go do some meditation. Read the Kathamrita, the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna. Read the works of Swamiji. Read the Gita. And, less social media probably, and even I think people should stay aware of current events, but even a little less news would probably be a good idea for us spiritually, because it's sort of calculated to make us angry and hate one another. And so that's my little comment on that. But I think it was a very good question.
Right, sir. Okay. Shombit Chaudhary asks, was there any connection between Devendranat Thakur's faction of Brahmo Samaj and Sri Ramakrishna?
Yes, there was. The connection was this. Many members of the Brahmo Samaj and of both, of course, it divided into a couple of factions during Sri Ramakrishna's lifetime. There was Devendranat Tagore, who was leading the original group, and then Keshav Chandra Sen's organization. There was a little bit of a scandal, and they broke away and they formed a separate branch. Sri Ramakrishna was personally closer to Keshav Chandra Sen. But he had interaction with Devendranat Tagore as well. And there's a very funny story, in fact, that Sri Ramakrishna tells. Sri Ramakrishna went to meet Devendranat Tagore, but Sri Ramakrishna was not a wealthy man, and he dressed very humbly. He wore very simple clothes. He wore a dhoti and some cloth draped over his shoulder, and he dressed very much as you see in the picture behind me, right? And so he went to see Devendranat Tagore at his house, and when he left, Devendranat Tagore was very angry. He turned to the person who had brought Sri Ramakrishna. He said, "If you bring him again, be sure he's dressed properly." So he apparently was not very impressed by Sri Ramakrishna's appearance. Right? And Ramakrishna himself tells that story and laughs and tells it with great amusement later on. Whereas Keshav Chandra Sen had a very warm relationship with Sri Ramakrishna, and he often had him to his house, and he would also go and see Sri Ramakrishna at Dakshineshwar. And when he passed away, when Keshav Chandra Sen passed away of tuberculosis, Sri Ramakrishna was very grieved by that. And so there were members of Devendranat's faction who also became disciples of Sri Ramakrishna. But I would say that it drew more from Keshav Chandra Sen's side. And Keshav Chandra Sen, I think his own views were softened a bit through his interactions with Sri Ramakrishna. The Brahmo Samaj was always very opposed to Murti Puja, right? They didn't like what they called idols, right? And but Keshav Chandra Sen concluded that if Murti Puja could create a personality as great as Sri Ramakrishna's, then it must not be so terrible, right? So he never adopted it himself, but his views on it softened. So his faction, I think, was certainly closer to Sri Ramakrishna, but Devendranat Tagore and his group were also very aware of Ramakrishna and that there was interaction there.
Okay. Okay, this is a long question. I have a question. Rakesh asks, in India, there are so many sages who have said that he has seen God, but Ramakrishna is among the very few whose philosophy is studied by many scholars. Do you think that without Vivekananda, Ramakrishna's teachings can be studied with logical interpretations by scholars?
Okay, that's a wonderful question. There are two answers to that question. The first answer is, historically, I think that without Vivekananda, no one else in the world outside of Bengal would have noticed Ramakrishna. He would not have become an object of study. So historically, that's definitely the case, that it was Swami Vivekananda who made the world aware of Sri Ramakrishna. I would say, though, that conceptually, it is possible to study Sri Ramakrishna's teaching on its own and find philosophical value in it. And in fact, I want to cite the work of a current scholar who's now very active. Actually, he is his former name is Ayan Maharaj. He has become a Swami now. As of February, he is now Swami Medananda. And Swami Medananda wrote a wonderful book. It came out from Oxford University Press in 2018. It's called Infinite Paths to Infinite Reality. And he shows that there is a very logical system in Sri Ramakrishna's thought. And this has not often been recognized by scholars because Sri Ramakrishna would speak in a very poetic way and he was a mystic and so on. And so the focus of scholarship has been more on him as a mystic. But yes, there is deep philosophy there. and a very interesting and important philosophy. And I didn't even really touch on that today very much, that can be studied. But yes, I don't think that he would have come to the notice of the rest of the world without Vivekananda.
Okay. The next question. Okay. Ayush De, he asks, is Kalpasutra festival Sri Ramakrishna told, sorry, in Kalpasutra festival, Sri Ramakrishna told his devotees his famous phrase, Tomader Chaitanya Hok. In what sense Sri Ramakrishna said the word Chaitanya, or what was the true consciousness according to him?
So Chaitanya, or Chaitanya in Bangla, Chaitanya
Yeah.
in Sanskrit, is consciousness. And when Sri Ramakrishna said, Tomade Chaitanya Hok, you are Chaitanya, right? You are consciousness. Here's where we can talk about some of his philosophy. It has a couple of different meanings. And for Sri Ramakrishna, these meanings were not exclusive. Whereas for the various systems of Vedanta, various schools of thought, they have sometimes been pitted against one another. So, first, there is, of course, the non dualistic interpretation, just that you are consciousness, meaning you are Brahman, Brahman alone is real, Brahman is consciousness, therefore, you are real, you are consciousness, you are that, right? In the words of the Chandogya Upanishad. And that's a non dualistic interpretation. At the same time, it can be taken to mean you have or you possess consciousness. You possess this same divine quality which characterizes God, right? That as a jiva, as a living soul, you have and really are made up of consciousness in the same way that God is, but you maintain the distinction between God and the individual. So these are two different schools of thought that have often debated in the last few centuries, the non-dualism and then the various forms of dualism or qualified non-dualism. For Sri Ramakrishna, and Swami Medananda's work, again, is a very good guide here, these two were not exclusive because he had experienced both. He had experienced himself as Chaitanya in the non-dualistic sense in his sadhana with Totapuri, but he had also experienced that merging of consciousness between the divine reality and the devotee in his various theistic experiences with Ma Kali, with Sri Krishna, and so on. And so for Ramakrishna, the devotee can interpret these words however they choose. If they want to see it as, I am sharing the same consciousness with the divine, they can interpret it that way. And if that is what fits with their sadhana, that is how they should think of it. Or they could see it in a non-dualistic way, as Swami Vivekananda did, for example, and say, no, I am consciousness. I am the divine is my true identity, which is the non-dual sense. And for Sri Ramakrishna, these are just two different facets of the same reality. They're not seen by him as contradictory.
Orithro Roy Bormon asks, my question is, can we assess from the teachings of Ramakrishna Paramahamsa how much spiritual practice is required for liberation? Did he think that intense love is needed to realize God?
Yes, definitely. So it's a very interesting question because you could say how much devotion is required, how much spiritual practice is required. If we mean by how much a quantity, like how many hours a day or minutes a day we need to practice, that's difficult to quantify because that's going to be different for every person. And of course, Hindu tradition teaches that we all have different past lives, right? We have different sanskaras. And so some people will progress very fast. Some people will take longer. And the people who progress very fast, it's just because they've been doing it longer through many, many lifetimes and maybe with more intensity. The real question is the intensity part. And this is where Sri Ramakrishna was loud and clear. He said, you have to have complete devotion, right? The intensity needs to be maximum, 100%. And that is the only way you achieve the result. Now, what does that mean for a householder? it doesn't mean necessarily that you give up your job and you give up your family and you go and meditate under a tree all day, because then you're not fulfilling your responsibilities, right? You're not fulfilling your duties. It might mean taking just a few minutes a day, but for those few minutes, thinking of nothing else, right, but God, right? Putting aside all your responsibilities for a period of time, and even a little bit every day of that type of devotion can have great results in terms of spiritual progress. Sri Ramakrishna tells a story, in fact, of you have two devotees, and one spends all of his time in the temple, all of his time praying, but he's often very distracted. And even when he's in front of the image of God, he's actually thinking of other things. And then you have another person who's working all day long. They work, they work, they work, but twice a day, they set aside their work and they just say very briefly, but with great sincerity, thank you, God, for everything, for all the blessings you've given me. And then they go back to work. And Ramakrishna says that second person is the better devotee, because for that moment, their mind is fixed completely on God, whereas the other person is going through the appearances, but they're actually very distracted. So deep intensity, uh, to the extent that it's possible to integrate it into your life. There's another story that I once heard, and I don't know if it's really about Sri Ramakrishna. The person who told me the story said that Sri Ramakrishna did this. I haven't seen it anywhere in any of the historical records, but it could be a story that he told. It's certainly in the spirit of his teaching. There's a story of a spiritual master who took a disciple they were walking by the river, and they walked into the river and were just sort of chatting as they were sort of wading in the water. And the devotee asks the master, how much devotion to God do I need to have to get realization? And according to the story, the master grabbed the disciple and shoved his head under the water. And he held him under the water for some time. And then finally he had mercy and let the man up. And he said to him, what were you thinking when I was holding you under the water? And he said, I was thinking, air, air, air. I need air. And the master says, only when you want God as much as you wanted air when you were under the water, only then will you see God. So I don't know if that's actually a true story of Ramakrishna, but it's very much in the spirit of his teaching.
Right, sir. Nilanjan Mitro asks, what is the aspect of life and teachings of Ramakrishna and Swamiji that can draw the younger generation to the relevance of the Vedantic way of life?
So I think that the younger generation, now of course, most of you who are listening, you are the younger generation, so you probably know better than I do. But I spend a lot of time with young people. I'm a college professor. And I sense that young people are being pulled in a couple of different directions. One is very practical. You want to get the training that you need so that you can get a job and be employed and have a productive life and not worry about paying the bills, not worried about poverty, doing something practical for the good of society that you can earn a living from. And that's, of course, very important. But there are also questions that a lot of young people have about, well, what's the purpose of life? Why am I doing all of this? What's really the meaning of it all? Am I just here to enjoy consumer products for a few years and then die? Or is there some deeper meaning or purpose? And that question of a deeper meaning and purpose, I think, is the one where Sri Ramakrishna and Swami Vivekananda are very relevant. And I think the thing that's especially useful to present to young people in this regard is that Sri Ramakrishna and Swamiji were also young people at one point, right? Thakur, he began his spiritual journey in his teen years when he lost his brother. That's when he really began his devotion in earnest. Devendranat, before he was Swami Vivekananda, he was a skeptic, and he was learning about science and rational philosophies, but also had this sense that there must be something important that these ancient traditions have to share, and that's why he began his spiritual pursuit. And so I think presenting Swamiji and Sri Ramakrishna in a way that is relatable. And here's where I mean, I think in one sense, the fact that you all grow up with pictures of these figures in your homes, in one sense, it's a very wonderful thing, but it can also pose a problem as well because they become larger than life and they become unrelatable. They become icons rather than human beings. So learning about their lives and their journeys and their struggles and the fact that they also struggled, they also had difficulties. Um, Narendranath had terrible problems when his father passed away and his family was left in debt. They had really bad financial problems. All of these things are the kinds of things we struggle with. So, and I think that's another great thing about these figures is they have not receded so far back into history that we have forgotten their humanity. Buddha lived 2,500 years ago. It's hard to conceive of what he was like as a human being. Jesus, 2,000 years ago. But Sri Ramakrishna, we have photographs of him. Swami Vivekananda, we have photographs of him. Right? They are within not such a distant memory that we can actually relate to them as people. And I think that that's important for connecting it with the concerns of young people today.
Okay. Amlan Shingho Roy asked, so do you think the teachings of Ramakrishna played a pivotal role behind the decline of Brahmoism from the second half of the 19th century?
I can't prove it, but I have long suspected that that is true. Because the reforms that the Brahmos wanted to introduce, many of them were wonderful and they were necessary and they were good. But the insistence on getting rid of Murti Puja, the insistence on getting rid of the traditional ritualistic forms of worship, I think was fatal for the Brahmos because those forms of worship are such a deep part of Hindu spiritual life. They are the outward expression of that spirituality. And you take it away, and what is really left? I mean, there's a philosophy, there are moral teachings, there's a lot that's very profound, but it loses that kind of concrete touch that enables people to grasp it in an intuitive way. So the worship proposed by the Brahmos was very much an imitation of the Protestant Christianity of the 19th century, and it's very plain and very austere. And I mean, if you ask me, would you rather? I mean, this is with no offense to my Christian friends. Would you rather go to a very plain Christian church, or would you rather go to Durga Puja? Well, to me, there's no question. Durga Puja is much more fun. There's much more going on there, right? So I think what Sri Ramakrishna's movement allowed, and I think Swami Vivekananda really played a pivotal role in this, was for people to adopt many of the reformist ideals of the Brahmos without giving up all of that very colorful, vibrant aspect of Hinduism. And so I think, yes, I suspect that it provided an alternative for people who were maybe drawn to the Brahmos but still liked their Durga Puja. Sri Ramakrishna gave them an alternative, and the Vedanta Society Ramakrishna Mission really filled the void.
Okay. Do we have more questions? Okay, yeah. Anisha Mondol, don't you think that Ramakrishna and Vivekananda's theory of spirituality are mostly stated on the transcendental thought? What is your opinion?
Okay, if I understand the question correctly, when I hear the term transcendental thought or transcendentalism, I think of American authors like Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau. I assume you're talking about their philosophy. And I would say that, yeah, there's tremendous overlap between the two because Emerson and Thoreau were tapping into the Upanishads and the Bhagavad Gita. Thoreau mentions the Gita very prominently in Walden. Emerson also, we know, was familiar with the Gita. He had some familiarity with early translations of the Upanishads that were present at his time. And so they were, the transcendentalists, the American transcendentalists were sort of going back to the same well, you could say, in a spiritual and literary sense that Sri Ramakrishna and Vivekananda were going to. And yes, these are universal teachings. This is another thing, we, even in our devotion to Sri Ramakrishna and Swami Vivekananda, we don't want to become tribalists ourselves and say, well, they're the only ones who said anything worthwhile, and nobody else said anything important. No, that's not true. In fact, the whole point of this teaching is that it is universal, and it can be discovered by people anywhere, in any culture, in any time. But I think in the case of the people we call transcendentalists, they were already drawing from this very ancient line of thinking from India. And I've recently written a book on Hinduism in America, which is in fact about to be published in just a couple more days. And one of the things I say there is that through the transcendentalists, the groundwork was laid in America for the acceptance of Swami Vivekananda's teaching, that he had a ready audience in America because people were already familiar with some of these ideas from the study of the transcendentalists. So I'd say, yes, that's true.
Right. Any other? Okay. Zenith Roy. Could you please throw a little light on the role played by the biographies of Max Muller and Romain Rolland in spreading awareness about Ramakrishna in the West?
Yes. Oh, they played a tremendously important role because these were the first books that Westerners read about Sri Ramakrishna. Max Muller's book, of course, was the very first. And Muller became acquainted with or aware of Sri Ramakrishna through actually meeting Swami Vivekananda. It's not, maybe it's more well known in India. It's not that well known that Swamiji and Max Muller actually knew one another. And they corresponded. They met at least a couple of times. And through Muller's writing on Sri Ramakrishna, that really was one of the ways that, in addition to Swamiji's own teaching, that people became aware of Ramakrishna in the West. And Romain Rolland actually built on, I mean, in my personal opinion, it's a much better book, built on and deepened the work that Max Muller had already done. And for many years, those two books were the only books available in English on Sri Ramakrishna. The Kathamrita was not translated as the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna into English until the 1940s by Swami Nikhilananda. So there's that whole first half of the 20th century where Muller's book and Rolland's book were the sources for people in places like America or England who wanted to know about Sri Ramakrishna. The Kathamrita was in Bangla, and most Westerners don't know that language, and it was not accessible to them. The other major Bengali work on Ramakrishna, of course, is the Sri Ramakrishna Leela Prasanga, Sri Ramakrishna's Divine Play. That also was not widely available in English until later on in the 20th century. So, from a literary perspective, Muller's book and Rolland's book were definitive for a very long time. And they're still classic works of literature, I would say. All right.
Okay, I think there's no more question. All right, I think with that we come to the end of this. Okay. Okay, so thank you so much, sir. Once again, a big thank you from the team. And, you gave us your valuable time. And I mean, this was such an enriching evening, I would say. So,
I hope so.
So, yeah, it was definitely. And stay safe, and we would like to hear more from you in future. Thank you so much, sir. Thank you. And to our audience, thank you so much for supporting us. Please follow our Facebook page and subscribe to our YouTube channel. And thank you. Stay safe. Good night. Thank you.
Thank you. Same to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.